Welcome back to the Cyber Resilience Brief, a SafeBreach podcast. I'm Tova Dvorin, your host, and as always, I'm joined by Adrian Culley, offensive cybersecurity engineer here at SafeBreach. Adrian, today's question is the one almost every CISO has asked us in the last 6 months. The frontier models, Claude Opus 4.6, the Mythos preview, ChatGPT 5.5, they now have serious offensive cyber capability baked in. So the question is, has any of that actually moved to the numbers? Are we seeing more 0 days, faster exploits, slower patching because of AI? Or is the headline running ahead of the data?
Tova, it's the right question, and I want to set a date stamp before we start because of how quickly things are moving. Everything we say today, right now on this recording, is as of mid-May 2026. That matters because the most important sources for this episode landed in the last 12 weeks. Google Threat Intelligence Group's 2025 zero-day review dropped in March, Mandiant's M-Trends 2026 in March, Id7's 2026 Global Threat Landscape report just after, and the GTIG report on adversaries using AI for vulnerability exploitation came out on just the 11th of May. So this is a very current picture.
Indeed. Now, before we get into the data, let's talk about Mythos. Some of our listeners will know that name, some won't. Let's do a quick clarification.
Claude Mythos Preview is Anthropic's internal but publicly evaluated preview model. It's the one UK AI Safety Institute published a cyber capability evaluation of earlier this year alongside their evaluation of GPT-5.5. So when we say Mythos today, we mean a real frontier model that government evaluators have publicly measured, not marketing. The findings are on the AISI.gov.uk website.
Okay, thanks for filling us in. Now let's start with capabilities. What has actually arrived in the model class itself? Because the vendor admissions in the last few months have been remarkable.
They have been. Let's start with DARPA. The AI Cyber Challenge final ran at DEF CON 33 last August 25. The cyber reasoning systems found 54 of the 63 synthetic vulnerabilities, narrated patches for 43 of them, and on top of that, discovered 18 previously unknown real bugs in open source code bases, 6 in C, 12 in Java.
And the prize money here was real.
Team Atlanta won $4 million. Trail of Bits Buttercup took $3 million for second place. Theorai got $1.5 million for third. But the bigger move was the license. All 7 finalist cyber reasoning systems were open sourced under an OSI approved license. That permanently lowered the floor of autonomous vulnerability finding tooling globally.
So what we're talking about here has been the lab scale baseline, but what about the production level frontier models?
So the Anthropic Claude Opus 4.6 system card, published in February, is the document I keep going back to. Anthropic state explicitly that the model has saturated their cyber benchmark stack. Roughly 100% on Cybench at pass at 30, 66% on CyberGym at pass at 1, and they say that the benchmark stack can no longer be used to track capability progression. The vendor is publicly admitting it has lost its ability to ceiling check its own model on offensive cyber.
That's not terrifying. Did they do anything about it?
Well, 2 months later, still only April this year, they shipped Claude Opus 4.7 with cyber capability, in their phrasing, differentially reduced during training. And they launched something called the Cyber Verification Program to selectively reopen access for vetted researchers and red teamers. That's the first time, to my knowledge, that a frontier vendor has dialed back offensive cyber capability at the training stage rather than just filtering it at inference. OpenAI did something similar. GPT-5.5's system card classifies the model as high capability in cybersecurity under the preparedness framework, short of critical, and they ship a separate GPT-5.5 cyber variant with trust-based access.
Right, and the UK's AISI is the independent voice on this.
Yes, and they're worth quoting, Tova, because they don't sell models. AISI rates GPT-5.5 as their strongest model on narrow cyber tasks, 90.5% on pass at 5. At their expert difficulty cyber range, they had GPT-5.5 averaging 71.4% and Claude Mythos Preview at 68.6%. That's statistical parity at the frontier.
And the end-to-end simulation they built, the headline finding from AISI was the cyber range.
The last ones. 32 steps, 20 human hours of expert effort, initial reconnaissance, call it T of active scanning, through privilege escalation, lateral movement on T1021 remote services, all the way to full domain takeover. An early Mythos checkpoint was the first model ever to solve it end to end. A newer Mythos solves it 6 times out of 10 attempts. GPT-5.5 does 3 out of 10.
What about trend lines?
Well, AISI's progression analysis estimated that 80% reliability cyber time horizon was doubling every 4 and a bit months between late 2024 and February this year. These latest models have substantially exceeded that. The capability curve isn't bending, it's exponentially pointing up.
So in other words, it's not just hype. The capability is real. It's at the frontier. It's the bleeding edge of cybersecurity and AI technologies right now. And the vendors and the regulators agree on roughly where it sits.
And we'll be right back.
Now let's get to the question that listeners care about. Is any of this actually changing the zero-day curve in practice, or are we just talking a lot about it?
So this is where I want to be careful and detailed, because the data has a different shape than the headlines suggest. GTIG's annual zero-day count for in-the-wild exploitation went from roughly 98 to 100 in 2023, down to 75 to 78 in 2024, and back up to 90 in 2025. So the headline is a rebound, not a surge. We're still in the same 60 to 100 band that's held since 2021.
I still think it's important for us, though, to understand where change actually happened, even if we're roughly within the same band. What happened here?
Absolutely, Tova. So the change was shape, not volume. Enterprise targeting hit an all-time high. 43 of the 90 zero days, so 48%, were aimed at enterprise products, particularly edge devices and identity infrastructure. Browser zero days collapsed to historical lows. Operating system and edge appliance zero days went up. So the attacker's center of gravity moved from the browser to your VPN concentrator, your SAP NetWeaver server, your SharePoint farm, your Ivanti Connect Secure box. That's where the action is.
And more than that, we saw that attribution flipped. I think that's where the gold is in the headline.
That's the one. For the first time in GTIG's tracking, commercial surveillance vendors out-attributed nation states. 18 of the 90 attributed to CSVs, Intellexa being the named example, versus 15 attributed to state-sponsored espionage. The Intellexa leak in December showed that at least 15 zero days burned since 2021 to keep predator spyware running.
So if I'm picking up what you're putting down here, a large chunk of the rebound actually has nothing to do with AI.
Exactly. It is mercenary spyware vendors adapting their exploit chains to new mobile and OS mitigations. It's not AI suddenly made vulnerability discovery cheap for everyone. Worth noting also is that observation bias plays a role. Apple's lockdown mode forensics, Citizen Lab, Amnesty Tech have all matured. We're seeing more CSV activity partly because we got better at instrumenting their victims.
Okay, so back to the topic of this episode, though. Where do AI, where does Mythos, where does the new ChatGPT 5.5 model actually show up in the larger picture of 0 days?
So two first landed in the window, and they're both important. On the defender side, Google's Big Sleep Agent, which is a Project Zero plus DeepMind collaboration, preempted CVE 2025-6965 in SQLite in July last year. GTIG had artifacts suggesting threat actors were stating that exploit but couldn't pin it to a CVE. Big Sleep, given those leads, identified the underlying bug. It got patched before exploitation. Google called it the first time an AI agent has been used to directly foil an in-the-wild exploitation attempt.
And what about the attacker side?
So that's the GTIG report from the 11th of May. They observed the first AI-developed zero-day exploit in the wild, a Python script bypassing two-factor authentication in a widely deployed open-source web admin tool. T1556 modify authentication process, if you want the technique. They didn't name the tool or the actor, but they say it was being staged for a mass exploitation event, and they disrupted it.
You know, it's always easy, at least for those of us who work in marketing, to spot when something's been written with AI, when something's been created image-wise with AI. When it comes to these attack detection vectors, how is this spotted as being AI authored? This
is the part I loved, Tova. The script had hallucinated CVSS score in the comments. Didactic Python doc strings written in textbook style. An ANSI color helper class with the kind of comprehensive help menu a human exploit author would never bother with. The AI style became its fingerprint.
It's ironic. The thing that was supposed to make these exploits invisible was the same thing that gives them away.
And we'll be right back.
It cuts very hard against the AI exploits or undetectable framing. The opposite is true so far. They're actually putting a target on their own backs. There's also the aisle on HackerOne, who reportedly attributed all 12 zero days in the January OpenSSL security release to their AI system. That's a community source number, primary OpenSSL advisory text, and HackerOne disclosure timestamps would tighten it. But if it stands, it's a real data point.
So if those are firsts, and Big Sleep has disclosed about 20 open source 0 days across 2025, plus a SQLite case, where does the volume sit? How many CVEs are publicly AI credited?
This is the single best counter-hype number in the corpus. Barracuda runs something they call the Mythos Hype Index. Yeah, that's what they've named it. Their May 12th tracker reports fewer than 200 CVEs publicly credit AI or large language model assisted discovery, against a 2025 CVE population of roughly 46,000 published. Staggering numbers. So less than 0.5% of disclosed CVEs publicly say AI helped find them.
Right, but remember that that's the publicly credited number. Researchers who use LLMs as a code review aid don't have to declare this.
Right. There's almost certainly more uncredited assistance, but the headline still stands. The AI discovery story is real, but small relative to the CVE population. And by the way, the CVE population itself is being reshaped by something that has nothing to do with artificial intelligence. CVE volume hit roughly 46 to 48,000 in 2025, a record, up 16 to 20% year on year. But that growth is structurally driven by CNA expansion. There are now 484 CVE numbering authorities. WordPress plugin-focused CNAs alone, PatchStack and WordFence, accounted for 44% of the 2024 CVEs.
Wow. What about NVD?
NVD effectively collapsed as a canonical enrichment service. NIST formally narrowed scope on the 15th of April this year. They'll prioritise CVEs in CISA KEV, federally used software, and EO 14028 critical software. Everything else goes into a triage queue. The NVD enriched 28% of the 2025 published CVEs versus 46% in 2024. So the denominator we'd use to compute AI's share of vulnerability discovery is shifting under our feet.
Let's move to exploit timelines, because this is where I think a lot of listeners have heard the most alarming numbers. Mandiant's time to exploit.
The number is real and it deserves a careful framing. Trends 2026, published in March, reports that the mean time to exploit across Mandiant's observed exploited CVE population in 2025 was minus 7 days.
Wait, -7 days? I'm reading that out loud. How's that even possible? It just doesn't sound right.
It doesn't sound right, does it? Across the same metric, the ARC was 63 days back in 2018-19, 44 days in 2021, 32 days in 21-22, 5 days in 23, 5 days in 24, and now negative. Exploitation precedes patch on average for the CVEs Mandiant saw weaponized last year. Examples on the books: SharePoint Tool Shell, CVE 2025 53770, Citrix Bleed 2, CVE 2025 5777, Ivanti Connect Secure, CVE 2025 0282. These are the population.
What's the caveat here?
The metric definition shifted. 2018 to 2022 numbers were medians of patch to exploit days. The 2023 onwards numbers are means over the observed exploited population. So the long arm from 63 days to -7 is directional, not statistically applies to apples to apples.
And moreover, the population here is selection biased as well.
It is biased towards incidents where Mandiant was retained for IR. Big game ransomware, advanced persistent threats, mass exploitation events. That said, multiple independent telemetries agree on the direction. BID7's 2026 report puts mean time to exploit at 28.5 days, down from 61. Median CVE to KEV listing dropped from 8.5 days to 5, and confirmed exploitation of the new CVSS 7 to 10 vulnerabilities went up 105% year on year. 71 in 2024, 146 in 2025.
Wow, and we got even more specific with Vulncheck's figure for same-day exploitation.
29% of 2025 KVs were exploited on or before the day the CVE was published. That's up from 23.6% in 2024. Verizon's DBIR 2025 for edge device and VPN CVEs specifically found the median time between vulnerability and publication and mass exploitation is 0 days. 0 days for 0 days. Edge device exploitation grew 8-fold as a share of vulnerability exploit actions year on old, 3% to 22%. So when people say the patch versus exploit gap has inverted, data supports that for the worst class of vulnerability.
So the related Mandiant number there, that's the access handoff figure.
22 seconds. Median time from an initial access broker handing off compromised access to the ransomware affiliate who's going to exploit it, that was hours in 2024, 22 seconds in 2025. The criminal supply chain has industrialized. That number reads as if it should be implausible. It isn't. It's just what happens when you put a Telegram channel and a payment rail between specialists.
And we'll be right back.
Now, we just spent a significant amount of time going through all of the data and really doing a deep dive into the full picture. But let's zoom out a little bit. How much of all of this is actually AI?
Less than the framing suggests. The cleanest piece of academic evidence for AI-driven exploit capability is CIEGNI, and that's an archive paper from September last year. A multi-agent LLM framework that reproduced 51% of CVEs published between June 2024 and May 2025 with verifiable working exploits. At an average cost of $2.77 CVE. On a pilot of 60 CVEs published after the model's knowledge cutoff, the success rate was 63%. That's a serious data point. It proves both capability and economics.
Proof of capability isn't proof of causation when it comes to these timeline numbers.
Right, and here's the corrective. Cyber Angel published a frank piece on this. They wrote, and I quote, "Attributing the time to exploit collapse solely to AI oversimplifies a complex phenomenon."
So as much as we're talking about AI and how much AI has changed our world, both in cyber and without, we have several alternative drivers. Let's start going into what's driving these changes that's not directly related to all of these AI models.
So there's three of them. Mass scanning infrastructure, SedMap, MassScan, Shodan, Census, has been able to scan the entire IPv4 space in under an hour for over a decade. Turnkey POC release norms, publishing a proof of concept alongside or right after the advisory, have been the trend for years. CISA's KEV mandate, BOD 2201, is itself a defender visibility compression. Once a CVE goes on the catalogue, exploitation gets logged. So a lot of the exploit timeline collapsed story has actually got perfectly good large language model explanations.
Okay, thank you for unpacking those. I think there's another counter signal we haven't discussed yet, which is the POC pollution problem.
Yes, Tova, and it cuts both ways. A-Noise published a piece called The POC Pollution Problem last year. They documented AI-generated exploits referencing non-existent endpoints, wrong parameter names, north bypass logic. Uncheck reports, publicly exploits and POCs went up 16.5% year on year, and explicitly flagged that a large share of that increase is AI-generated content, much of it non-functional. Only about 1% of the 2025 CVEs were exploited in the wild by year-end, despite the POC flood. So we have to be precise. The proof of concept volume looks like an AI surge. The working exploit volume hasn't moved the same way.
Adrian, let's pivot to the defender side, the patch timeline. Did AI move that curve?
This is the part of the answer that should worry CISOs most. The defender curve has not meaningfully moved, and in places it's gone the wrong way. EdgeScan's 10th edition vulnerability stats report, that's the 2024 data report, mean time to remediate high or critical application vulnerabilities was 54.8 days. For critical-only applications, it was 74.3 days. 37% of the vulnerabilities discovered in a 12-month window in larger enterprises were still unresolved at the year end.
And that's only one report. If you read Vericode's report, it's an even starker difference.
Absolutely, Tova. Vericode's State of Software Security 2026, they titled it Drowning in Security Debt. In-floor fix time has risen 47% since 2020. The floor half-life is 252 days overall, 315 days in public sector. 82% of organisations now carry security debt. 60% of those carry critical debt. Year on year, critical debt is up 20%.
So we've got two distinct stories here, right? It's the introduction velocity versus fix velocity story.
Exactly. Detection is faster than remediation, and the gap is widening. The number that should make the room go quiet, though, is Qualys. A TIU team analysed over 1 billion CISA KEV remediation records across 10,000 organisations over 4 years. The percentage of critical vulnerabilities still open at the 7-day mark has worsened from 56% to 63%.
Wait, so you're saying that the defender population is getting worse at remediating, not better, even though we have all of those new tools at our disposal? How's that possible?
Well, at the population level, that's absolutely what the figures say. BitSight's analysis of 1.4 million organisations against the KEV catalogue found more than 60% of CVEs are remediated past CISO's deadline. Federal agencies are about 56% more likely to meet the deadline than non-federal, but even there, plenty of misses, and the GAO and OIG audit reports continue to flag KV overdue items in HVA systems. Teva's State of Patch Management Survey is the operational number. 77% of organizations need at least a week to deploy patches, against a CrowdStrike cited 48-minute e-crime breakout time.
So this is the picture. Ultimately, attackers can weaponize in hours, but defenders need a week to deploy. Let's go through one more round of statistics with the IBM Cost of a Data Breach report to figure out what the numbers are in AI helping the defender side in practice.
So IBM's Cost of a Data Breach 2025 found mean time to identify and contain breaches fell to 241 days, a 9-year low. Organizations using AI and automation extensively saved $1.9 million per breach and cut breach lifecycle by about 8 days. Average global breach cost fell to $4.4 million, 9% year-on-year drop. So AI on the defender side does show up, but, and this is the bit that matters, 63% of breached organizations had no AI governance policies at all. So the AI uplift is concentrated in a mature minority, while a long tail goes the other way.
So this is the adoption asymmetry that we're talking about.
The asymmetry is not about capability, Tova. The capability is symmetric. The same model class powers Expo's autonomous pen testing agent and Google's Big Sleep Defender. The same model class is what I'll used on OpenSSL and what Anthropic ships in Claude Code Security. They launched that in beta on the 30th of April with 500 plus previously unknown open source vulnerabilities surfaced.
So wait a second, if the capabilities are symmetric, where does the asymmetry lie here?
Deployment scaffold. There's an excellent piece on CJE.io from last month that frames it as well as anyone. Offense scales with compute, defense scales with committees.
Adrian, can you unpack that for us?
The attacker's velocity is gated by compute and creativity. Low cost of failure, the defender's velocity, is gated by enterprise policy, change control, production stability, compliance review, procurement, vendor consolidation, board appetite, insurance posture, and organizational consensus. The Strike 48 CISO survey, published 2 weeks ago, captures this exactly. 84% of CISOs believe AI agents should run a tier 1, but only 22% will actually fully automate even basic level 1 tasks. A 62-point gap between belief and deployment.
Wow, and there's even a benchmark finding here that backs the structural point.
Yes, the Cyber SOC Eval, the CrowdStrike Meta benchmark published last September. Their headline finding is that reasoning model gains do not transfer cleanly to defensive SOC reasoning under current training recipes. So even if defender deployment caught up tomorrow, the model class isn't yet trained to think like a defender in the same way. It's trained to think like a coder. That's a real ceiling that the offensive side isn't constrained by.
And we'll be right back.
Okay, we went through a lot of numbers, more than usual. We went through a deep dive on what the landscape looks like in practice and different estimates. If, listeners, you're still with us by now, what should the people listening actually do about this? They've got 6 months until the end of the financial year 2026 budget. What's the operational call here?
4 moves, and they're not new. They're the moves you'd make even if AI weren't in the picture, just with one more urgency. 1, assume time to patch is not your control. The Rapid 7 phrase is the right one. The obsolescence of time to patch. Stop measuring yourself by patch SLA alone. Measure yourself by exposure window. The gap between vulnerability publication and the moment your compensating controls would catch an exploit attempt. That's the number that actually correlates with breach outcomes.
Okay, what's your second suggestion?
Validate your controls continuously. This is the AV part of the conversation, adversarial exposure validation, which Gartner formalized as a category in its first AV-specific market guide on the 24th of March. AEV is the validation layer, pillar 4 of the CTEM cycle. You simulate the attack not against a synthetic target, but against your actual production controls, and you measure whether your network inspection, your DLP or EDR, would have caught it. SafeBreach's own 2026 State of the Breach report aggregated 1.8 million attack simulations executed by customer enterprises in 2025. The block rate baselines were sobering. Network inspection, 65%. DLP 70%, endpoint 53%. And against Russian GRU tactics specifically, a 28% miss rate. That's not vendor pitching, that's empirical control effectiveness baseline of the customer population that has the discipline to measure itself.
And I understand that point 3 is the bug bounty signal to noise problem.
Absolutely, Tova. Daniel Stenberg, the curl maintainer, did the curl bug bounty on the 1st of February this year. Over 7 years, he paid about $90,000 across 81 findings. Genuine vulnerability share of submissions collapsed from roughly 17% in early 2025 to 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 by late 2025. Linus Torvald said the kernel security mailing list is almost entirely unmanageable. FFmpeg publicly called Google's Big Sleep reports CVE slop. If your Defender program accepts vulnerability submissions, you need a triage stack designed for AI-generated noise. Assume the signal-to-noise ratio has degraded by a factor of 3 to 5.
And that brings us to our final point, which is AI governance. It's a must-have.
100% Tova. Govern your own agentic AI before you deploy more of it. The KiteWorks 2026 forecast report found 100% of organizations have agentic AI on the roadmap, but 60% cannot quickly terminate a misbehaving agent. 63% cannot enforce purpose binding on agents. 33% lack adequate audit trails. The Defender side AI surge is itself a fresh attack surface. The threat model is no longer just what's the attacker doing with their LLM, it's what's their own agent doing with the credentials we just gave it.
Adrian, for those of our listeners who are listening to this at 1.5 or 1.7 side speed, I just got to this part. Can you give me a one-line summary?
Capability is at the frontier, and vendors are dialing it back at training time, which tells you the line is in view. The zero-day curve moved in shape, not in volume, and the commercial spyware industry explains more of the rebound than AI does. The exploit timeline is real. Exploitation precedes patch on average now, but mass scanning, turnkey POCs, and KEV pull each get credit too. The patch curve hasn't moved, and the Defender deployment velocity.
The honest answer to the question we opened with, Adrian, has AI changed the vulnerability lifecycle?
Yes, at the margin, with 2 clean firsts on the board. Big sleep on the Defender side, the May GTIG two-factor authentication bypass story on the attacker side, and no, not yet in the way the headlines suggest. The labs with the strongest commercial incentive to declare a capability movement, Anthropic's RSP version 3, OpenAI's Preparedness Framework version 2, explicitly do not declare cyber at threshold. That's the single biggest evidence point against AI changes everything.
Adrian, as always, thank you so much for doing all of this deep research on the AI attack landscape and the AI defense landscape today. We'll be back next week, but until then, and until next time, stay safe with SafeBreach.
The Cyber Resilience Brief is a SafeBreach podcast. Executive produced by Adrian Culley and Tova Dvorin. Music produced by Sar Dresner. Hosted, edited, and compiled on Riverside. For more about SafeBreach and how you can validate your security controls across your entire IT infrastructure, visit us at www.safebreach.com. That's www.safebeach.com.